This happened 5 years ago, and I can still remember it vividly. I was excitedly preparing for the New Year's party, and I decided to buy some decorations online. As I was scrolling through the website, I suddenly felt a weird sensation, almost as if I was being watched. It was a strange feeling because I was inside the safety of my home, and I lived alone. I tried to shake it off as my imagination and continued browsing, but the feeling persisted. Hours passed, and I could still feel as if I was being watched. It was now becoming too much for me to ignore, and I got up from the couch and started looking around the house. I checked all the rooms, closets, and even the attic, but there was no one there. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the feeling persisted. While browsing through the shopping website, I could still feel an uneasy and ominous feeling in the pit of my stomach. I tried calling my friend Natalie for some comfort, but she didn't answer. The clock was ticking, and the sun had already set. I was starting to feel increasingly unsafe in my own house. I needed to find a trustworthy person to spend the night with, but my contact list was of no use. In a state of desperation, I finally called my sister Emily, hoping she would come to my rescue. The clock was ticking as I waited for my sisters to arrive, and as the night progressed, I started feeling increasingly unsafe in my own home. Every creak and sound made me jump out of my skin. As I waited for my sister to arrive, the feeling of being watched lingered. I brushed it off as mere paranoia and continued to sit in the living room, trying to distract myself by watching TV. But the feeling persisted, like an invisible presence lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. Suddenly, the familiar sound of my phone's notification bell chimed, breaking the silence and drawing my attention to the screen. It was a message from my sister Emily, announcing her arrival with a short and sweet message, "I'm here." With that, the doorbell rang, and I quickly rushed to open the door, feeling relieved that someone was finally here to share that eerie feeling with me. As Emily entered the room, I couldn't help but notice the stern expression on her face. Her first sentence caught me off guard. "Just remember this, I'm not here because I was worried about you or was bored at my place. I'm here to do you a favor." Despite her initial statement, I was grateful that she had come to visit me and offered her help. After catching up with my sister, we decided to do something to pass the time together. We eventually opted to unwind by watching a movie for the evening. However, as the movie progressed, an insidious feeling crept over me, as if something was not quite right in my home. Without warning, Emily suddenly broke the silence by saying, "Is there someone else here?" I felt a chill run down my spine upon hearing her say that, because I was feeling the presence in my home, and she must have felt it too. I shook my head to indicate a negative answer, and as she stared at my expression, her intuitive mind immediately grasped the reason for my call. It was then that I noticed a slight movement out the corner of my eye. I hesitantly turned my head in that direction, but to my surprise, there was nothing there. It was at that moment when Emily tapped on my shoulder before pointing toward the long curtain that was all the way at the end of the hall beside the windows. We both noticed that the curtain was moving, but there wasn't any wind blowing through the windows. My heart started to race as Emily quickly grabbed a vase, and I too looked around for anything I could use as a weapon before we cautiously made our way towards the moving curtain. My heart raced as we silently pulled the curtain together, hoping to find the place empty. However, as soon as the curtains parted, my eyes widened in horror. There, lurking in the shadows, was my ex-boyfriend. I couldn't tell how long he had been there, but the thought of him watching me made my skin crawl. My mind raced with questions. What did he want? Why was he there? I felt a mix of fear and anger, unsure of how to react. My sister and I tried to remain calm, but as the reality of the situation set in, fear took hold. He was about to hit us and run, but before he could do that, Emily took action and hit him on the head with the vase she was holding. As he passed out, we called 911, and waited anxiously for the police to arrive. When they did, they escorted my ex-boyfriend out for questioning, but the damage had already been done. The night of the incident left my sister and me deeply unsettled and apprehensive. We clung to each other, too terrified to even think of falling asleep. My home, once a comforting sanctuary, now felt like a menacing presence, and we couldn't shake off the sense of danger that seemed to lurk in every corner. Every creak and rustle amplified our fear, and we couldn't shake off the feeling that someone was still hiding in the shadows, watching us with malicious intent. The following day, I hastily packed my belongings and fled to Emily's house. The New Year party that I had been planning was scheduled to take place there that year, and while nothing untoward occurred after the incident, I couldn't help but feel anxious and on edge. I never would have guessed that my ex-boyfriend would turn out to be a stalker. It was a sobering reminder that people's true colors can be difficult to discern, and I was grateful that I'd broken up with him when I did. Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so. It was 3 a.m. and I was stumbling my way back home from the New Year's Eve party. I was feeling quite tipsy after having an amazing time with my friends. We watched the mesmerizing fireworks display, and I even locked lips with a stunning woman I had met earlier in that evening. After that, we headed to one of my friends' places where we danced our hearts out to some upbeat music. The melody of one of the songs that played at the party lingered in my mind as I drove along the road. Suddenly, I spotted a car parked on the side with a stunning woman standing beside it. Her backless white dress hugged her curves, and I couldn't help but feel drawn toward her. My curiosity got the best of me, and I parked my car beside hers to offer help. She seemed anxious, and her eyes darted around nervously before she revealed that her car had broken down and she needed to reach somewhere urgently. Sensing her distress, I offered to drop her off at the destination. After some hesitation, she nodded and took the seat beside me. Just as I managed to get a kiss from the woman I met earlier in the party, I was hoping I could benefit from helping this girl, but I was also conscious of not coming across as a creep or intrusive. Therefore, I made sure to present myself as a trustworthy and friendly person. As she directed me, my attention was divided between the road and her. I couldn't help but notice her stunning figure and couldn't resist admiring it. My thoughts drifted to touching her, but I quickly dismissed them, not wanting to scare her off. Despite my internal struggle, I remained respectful and focused on the task at hand, hoping that maybe I could secure her number later. The scenery outside the car window caught my attention, and I realized we had been driving for a while without me noticing. I looked out to see a deserted, barren land passing by us. When I turned my attention to the road ahead, I saw that it was uneven and led to an unknown destination. As I slowed down the car, I looked around the unfamiliar surroundings to try and figure out our location. However, the road behind and the one ahead looked the same, offering no clues as to where we were headed. Feeling a sense of confusion and disorientation, the question, "Where are we?" escaped my lips as I turned my head to see where she was sitting, only to be stunned that she was no longer there. Panic set in as I searched the car to see if she was playing a prank on me, but she was nowhere to be found. The knot in my stomach grew tighter as I wondered where she had gone to. As I shifted my attention toward the road ahead, my eyes caught sight of a motionless figure lying on the asphalt. My reflexes kicked in, and I slammed on the brake pedal in utter panic. As I tried to focus and examine the scene more closely, my heart skipped a beat as I immediately recognized the white dress. It was her, the girl I gave a lift to. My chest felt tight as I stepped out of the car and hesitantly moved towards her. The stench of decay hit me hard, and I struggled to keep my composure as I inched closer to the figure. The closer I got, the more overpowering the putrid smell became, filling my nostrils and making my eyes water. Her face was a terrifying sight, making me feel sick to my stomach. It seemed she had been dead for days. Terror stabbed my heart as I backed away from her before running back to the car. I couldn't understand if she was lying dead there, then who in the world was in my car earlier? I turned the key in the ignition of my car, but to my dismay, the engine sputtered and refused to start. I tried again and again, but it was as if the car was mocking me. That's when I saw her, the ghostly figure of that woman. She stood right in front of my car, staring at me with a look that sent chills down my spine. It was as if she was staring into my soul, and I could feel nothing but blind terror. I kept trying to start the car, but it seemed like she was preventing it from starting. I could feel her getting closer as she was about to enter the car. But then, a miracle happened. The car started on its own. I wasted no time in turning the car around and started driving back in the direction from which I had come. My plans for a fun New Year's Eve were shattered by the unexpected encounter with the supernatural. The memory of her haunting presence lingered in my mind as I drove away, leaving behind the ghostly apparition that I had tried to assist. For some reason, I felt I should call 911 and report everything that happened. However, the operator on the other end of the line didn't seem to believe me. They brushed me off, claiming that my inebriation had caused me to hallucinate a ghost. Despite my insistence, they dismissed my concerns, promising only to investigate the location where I had discovered her. After that call, I never saw that woman again, and I somehow managed to navigate my way out of the maze-like path. That night, sleep eluded me, and my mind kept replaying the disturbing events from earlier. It's been years since then, but the memory still lingers on like a horror movie, refusing to let go of its hold on me. The incident feels as vivid as if it happened just yesterday, but the nightmares still manage to find their way into my sleep, leaving me shaken and restless. It's disheartening to think that anyone I've confided in about has brushed me off as mere figment of my imagination, when the truth is, it was a real experience that left me scared for my life.
I've lived and worked here in Portland, Maine, and every spring we get biblical levels of rain. It's a huge pain in the butt, but it's something you just learn to live with after a while. You invest in a good umbrella and a waterproof coat and just muddle on like a good Mainer does. Although if some of you Californians saw the kind of weather we endure, you'd be more than likely to call us maniacs as opposed to Mainers. As I said, for the most part, the rain is nothing but a minor irritation, a price we pay for the magnificent falls that are enjoyed by leaf peepers from all over the country. But as I found out one dark and rainy night, the climate in this area of the country can sometimes make it straight up dangerous to live here. So picture the scene. It's raining cats and dogs. I'm walking back to the apartment in an older part of town and it's full dark. One of the streets on my regular route has been around since the early 1800s and is still lined with cobblestones, while the sidewalks are these big, flat, slate-like slabs that can get super slippery in the spring and fall. I'm pretty sure it's because of a special kind of algae or moss that grows on them, making them really slimy, but I'm not a biologist, so don't quote me on that. All I know is it can be like a freaking ice rink at certain times of the year, but on one occasion it was more of a death trap than an ice rink. I'd already gotten an idea of how slippery it was as I was walking, but as I got a text that I assumed was from my boss, hopefully regarding the raise I've been probing for, the light from my phone must have thrown my vision off and, in turn, my footing. Because one minute I'm just walking along minding my own business, and then next, I'm lying on the sidewalk with the wind knocked out of me, as the ground beneath me just up and disappeared or something. The first thought that registers through my brain is all sorts of expletives that I can't repeat here, and as I try to find my feet again. Only I can't. My left foot just doesn't seem to do what I want it to, and when I look, it's flopping around in this way that makes my stomach churn. That's when the pain starts to throb through my leg, and in seconds, it's like my entire body is just racked with agony. Every time I move, this shooting pain just zaps up my calf and thigh, and I begin to realize I've suffered either a serious break or a very serious sprain. Any other time, I'd have just called 911 there and then, but my phone must have slipped out of my hands as I fell, and when I looked around for it, it was nowhere to be seen. I started thinking it might have slipped off the sidewalk or something, but right as I'm about to look, something else grabs my attention. A sewer drain, just off the sidewalk. One of those metal grid kinds, not a culvert, and it hits me that my phone might have actually clattered down into the sewer as I fell. It was a horrendous stroke of misfortune, but I figured it couldn't be long until a passerby stumbled across me so I could get the help I needed. But as I'm looking around, getting increasingly soaked by the relentless New England deluge, I realize there's not a soul on the streets. You get accustomed to Maine rain, that's a given, but you still avoid going out in the worst of it. It occurs to me that if I'm actually wanting any help, I might actually have to call out for it, or even scream for it. So there I was, forced to actually scream for help, and as weird and prudish as it sounds, I don't know what was worse, the pain, or the sheer embarrassment that I'd fallen and couldn't get up. I give 3 solid blasts of "Can anyone hear me? Help, I'm hurt real bad," but no one seems to respond. Like I can see lights on in windows of apartment buildings mere yards away, so I knew well people could hear me. They just chose not to help. It was pretty crushing thinking that people actually knew I was there, but didn't lift a freaking finger to help. But I guess that's life in big cities these days. People are terrible. Assume everything is fake or a scam or whatever. It is what it is. Anyways, a few minutes go by and it slowly becomes apparent that no one is coming to help, and that if I want to actually make any progress in getting to the emergency room, I might actually have to drag myself along the wet sidewalk until I find someone compassionate enough to actually help me. But just before I'm forced to undergo such an indignity, I suddenly see the silhouette of a person appear in a streetlight, and I start calling out to my shadowy potential savior. Now, you'd think if you saw a girl lying in the street calling out for help with obvious pain in her voice, you'd at least change your pace to get over to her a little faster. But this guy seems to notice me, stop for a second, and then just carried on walking over to me at the same speed, without saying a word. It was a weird feeling having that overwhelming relief turn into absolute dread in just a few moments. The person approaching me wasn't giving off any of the compassionate, helpful vibes that I expected. In fact, they were giving off quite the opposite. They didn't say a thing in response when I was all like, Sir, I think I've broken my ankle. Can you please call 911? Just stayed completely silent. Seconds later, I'm looking up at this guy, rain splashing my eyes, and with his hood up I can barely make out any of his facial features. "What happened to you?" he asked, seemingly barely concerned at all. It was also like he hadn't been paying any attention at all when I actually told him what the issue was. Like, at the risk of sounding ungrateful, I totally spelled it out for this guy, and to have him reply with, "Huh? What?" was as frustrating as it was unnerving. I tell him all over again, but skip the backstory in favor of just begging him to call 911. He barely moves, or rather he made 0 attempts to get his cell phone out to make the call. Instead, he just towers over me, silently staring at me like I was some kind of animal curiosity. I dropped my phone. Can you see it anywhere?" I remember asking him. At that moment, he did actually start looking around for it, which momentarily restored a little of my hope that he actually wanted to help. But in hindsight, I don't think he'd have handed it over if he'd found it. Because his next move, one which I mistook for him trying to help me up, was to basically start patting me down for valuables before he just went and grabbed my purse off me. I was stunned to silence as he rifled through its contents, helping himself to a few loose bills. I couldn't believe anyone could be so callous, even in a big city like Portland. I was disappointed, angry, and in pain, but I wasn't outright scared until the guy took out my photo ID that I use for work, stared at it for a moment, and then slid it into his pocket. Because that's when I realized that he wasn't doing this just for monetary gain. He wasn't so much of a thief or an opportunist as he was an outright predator. And the thought of what he was going to do next completely terrified me. He didn't walk away with the money and my ID. He just carried on standing over me, staring, probably delighted at how helpless I was, how he could do whatever he liked to me, and there wasn't a soul around to stop him. A 38-year-old woman, and I felt like crying, like a little girl. I begged him not to hurt me, to just leave with the money he'd taken. I think he just got off on that, but what else was there to do? I was in no position to fight back. Best I could hope for was to hit him with my keys if he tried to, take things further. Then right as I'm reaching for them, lying there, discarded on the sidewalk, I hear one of the sweetest sounds I'd ever heard in my life.
Excuse me, is everything all right?
It was a guy's voice, polite but aggressive, accusatory. Someone had finally emerged from one of the nearby apartment buildings, and at that, the hooded guy starts walking off, just as chill as ever.
Hey, I'm talking to you.
The guy says before looking back at me, then calling back inside for, I'm guessing, his wife and someone to call the cops. He then rushes out to ask if I'm okay, which triggers the biggest wave of ugly crying as I just point to my messed up ankle in between shakes of my head. Cut to a few hours later, I'm laid up in the hospital with a broken ankle, high as a kite on the best stuff the Blue Cross can buy. I gave a statement to the cops, had a little cry with my mom when she came to visit, then went about informing all my coworkers that I wouldn't be seeing them for a few months. I got some small amount of closure when I heard the guy was arrested for petty theft. Apparently he had a history of drug addiction and mental illness, and had committed a handful of opportunistic robberies over the last few years. As a result, this last strike was going to send him back to jail for a few years. Something I take a great deal of comfort in.
I've worked as a mall Santa for the past few Christmases now. I'm only 33, but thanks to my complete lack of exercise routine, I definitely have the figure for it. And once I have the beard and the wig and hat combo going, there's basically no telling the difference between me and a 60-year-old dude. Mall Santa work can be tough for a few different reasons. Number one, the hours are really long, and the pay can be really terrible depending on which model you manage to get employed by. Number two, the kids can be little monsters, and their parents can be just as terrible an occasion too. But the reason I'm actually considering skipping the entire thing this year and having something of a budget Christmas is that you get some seriously disturbing things happening from time to time. I mean, the kinds of things that keep you up at night, even after a long, exhausting shift. However, the worst thing that's ever happened to me as a mall Santa was actually nothing to do with kids. Parents are terrible, paying hours, and I'm sure you'll see why after I tell you the story. So every year, usually when the mall is required is during weekday mornings, we get specially organized visits from special needs kids or adults with learning disabilities who were bussed in from the surrounding areas. Pretty much every other mall Santa I've spoken to about this agrees that it can be one of the most rewarding parts of the job, and that the adults with learning difficulties are often even more excited about the prospect of meeting Santa. And some of the kids are literally the only downside is that some of them are so heavy that my thighs hurt after having like 50 in a row sit on my lap. But other than that, it's honestly one of the best parts of the job. Last year, I'm in the middle of one of the special sessions when I get this girl coming up and sitting on my lap. I say girl, but she was legitimately a grown woman looking like she was in her mid-30s or something. But she had a mental age of about 9 or 10. All smiles and giggles, way shy about meeting Santa again. It was cute as all get out. But the interaction was not so cute, and turned that way pretty fast. So, like I said, she's all giggles and smiles as she comes up to sit on my lap, and I give her the usual spiel asking her name, how old she is, if she's excited for Christmas, and all that stuff. Then when it comes to asking her what she wants me to bring her on Christmas Eve, she starts thinking about it and smiling at first, before she suddenly gets super serious with a touch of sadness. I'm asking her if she's okay, what the problem is, and she's like shaking her head, acting like she doesn't want to tell me anything. I take the time and explaining that no matter what she asks for, I'll try my very, very best to bring it to her. No matter how big or small it is, that Santa always tries his best to bring good little girls and boys what they ask for on Christmas. She takes a moment. Then the exchange goes a little something like this. You mean it, Santa? He can get me anything I want for Christmas. Anything. Anything you want. Just tell me and I'll do my best. Okay. Well, at this point, she lowers her voice to a whisper and leans into my ear. I want my boyfriend to stop hitting me. Can you make that happen? Was sort of dumbstruck for a second. Like all of the things I thought she was going to ask, that would most definitely not have topped the list. I remember just nodding at first, trying to find the words and being like, go make that happen for you. Sure, no problem. She was so happy to hear that I'd fix it for her and gave me the biggest hug I think I'd ever received while working as a mall Santa. I had to put on a huge smile. And of all the times I've had to fake being jolly and merry, that time with her was the hardest. But I just felt numb, like completely broken by what I'd heard. And I just tried my best to get through the rest of the session without bursting into tears. I remember all these thoughts rushing through my head, terrifying ideas of institutional abuse. She said boyfriend, and that made it extra creepy. Like, sure, it could have been just another guy in her care group or something. Another adult with learning difficulties who she'd hooked up with somehow. But there was nothing to say that it wasn't a member of her care team that was like abusing her in a completely different sense. To not just physically, but, well, catch my drift. So when the session was over, I approached the member of the care team that had organized the trip and accompanied them to the mall. I didn't let anything slip. I just told them how great I thought the session had gone, and that's have a few details about the group that had organized them. As it turned out, they were all from the same care home type thing. So I made a note of the name of the place as well as the name of the girl that it was apparently being abused. That night I couldn't sleep. I just kept picturing some evil monster abusing that poor girl, taking advantage of their position to put some poor special needs woman through torture, then telling her that she'd be killed if she ever breathed a word of it to anyone. And here's where stuff starts getting even more intense. Now, I could have just called 911. With the info I had at hand, registered a general complaint and then heard nothing back about it. Buddy, a buddy of mine, had a cousin with the local police department, and not just some gumshoe B-cop either. They were a detective. It took some convincing, but I convinced my buddy to pass along their cell phone number so I could get in touch with the dude personally. It took a while, but I managed to get through to the guy who sounded pretty skeptical at first and seemed kind of irritated that his cousin had given me this number. But once I explained what the issue was, his tone changed completely. Now, I didn't find this out until way later from my friend, but his cousin had a special needs daughter who was probably going to have to either live with them for the rest of their life or was going to head into a group home at some point so she could have some measure of independence. So when I explained the situation with the special needs girl I met as a mall Santa, it obviously hit the guy right in the feels as the topic was so close to home. The detective tells me that he'll look into it. Thanks for letting him know. I get him to promise to tell me if anything comes up, and he says yes, and we hang up. And that was the last I heard of it for like a month. Then, maybe 5 or 6 weeks, I'd almost forgotten about the whole thing. Christmas was over the mall. Santa's job was way behind me, and I was back to working my regular hours as a self-employed mechanic. Then I get a call from a number that seems vaguely familiar, although I wasn't quite sure why. Turns out, It was my buddy's detective cousin, who reminded me of the tip that I'd given him about the care company. Of course I remembered, but by that time I really didn't think anything would come of it. But oh, how wrong I was. The detective thanks me for the information, and although he told me he couldn't say too much, he told me to keep an eye out on local media outlets. The next thing I know, it's all over the local papers that there have been a misconduct scandal involving a local care company. I picked up a copy and read the story, only to find out that it's the very same one I had reported. The long and short of it is that the cops had uncovered endemic levels of abuse in the company, stuff that varied from financial discrepancies to straight up physical abuse. And sickeningly enough, there was even cases of care workers taking advantage of mentally disabled females in ways that were seriously inappropriate. There were numerous arrests, with some of the sleazier and violent criminals looking like they were going to get years in prison for how long they so cruelly taken advantage of some of the most vulnerable people in society. It made me sick to my stomach to read about how some people could bring themselves to do something like that. But it was stopped, and I felt incredible that I'd actually managed to be a part of the chain of events that brought the whole thing crashing down. I just hope that that poor girl, who was obviously pretty traumatized by what was happening to her and just not being able to understand why it was happening, either found some measure of peace after it. And in a way, Santa did kind of bring her exactly what she wanted, even if it wasn't on Christmas Day. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a thought that never fails to make me tear up.